You don't have to be a pro to shoot like one. Let's break photography down the easy way. Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Reggie Bana, the owner of RBS Media Productions, and I have been a photographer for approximately 5 years at this point. I currently specialize in wedding photography and I do a lot of portrait work, so you could break that down into boudoir photography, working with models, and even some corporate work. Pretty much, I love photography. I love everything about getting subjects in front of a camera and taking their picture. And I know for a lot of people, wanting to get into this hobby or business can seem a little daunting. So I want to break down the basics of photography in a very simple manner. So if you vibe with this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The word photograph is actually a breakdown of two Greek words. Photo means light and graph means to write. So essentially, when you take a photograph, you're writing with light. Now, I want you to think about that. Without light, you do not have an image. You are always chasing light. You always need some form of light in order to take an image. Think of a camera like an electronic eyeball. Just like your eye sees the world, a camera sees light and turns it into a photo. Light bounces off of everything around you, and when you take a photo, that light enters the camera through the lens. The lens acts like a window for the camera. So we need to break down some terminology first, prior to getting into some things. Exposure is how light or dark the entire picture is based on your camera settings. And exposure is largely dictated by three things within the entire exposure triangle: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Now, aperture is the hole inside the lens that can get bigger or smaller to let in more or less light. Think of it like your eye's pupils. When it's dark, your pupils will get bigger, and when it's bright, it gets smaller. This limits the amount of light coming into your body. Now, aperture is shown as an f-stop. Wide apertures have a lower f-stop. Think of a number like f1.2, f1.4, f2.8. And narrow apertures have a higher f-stop. Think f11, f8, f16. Not only does this aperture control the amount of light, it also controls the focal plane and the bokeh. We'll get into focal plane a little later. This photo was taken with the Canon R5 with the Sigma 135mm f1.8. As you can see, there's a clear separation from the subject to the background. The background is almost like indiscernible. Now, this photo was taken with the same setup, but it's shot at an aperture of f16. And as you can see, there's actually details within the background. You can see some leaves and some of the fence. And as you stop down more, you would begin to see that the entire photo is more in focus with little to no separation from the subject to the background. But that doesn't always mean that you should always shoot wide open. There are definitely some instances where you should consider a higher aperture to make sure certain things are in focus. The second part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. There is a curtain that goes over the sensor to let in a certain amount of light. It opens and closes to let light hit the sensor for a very short amount of time. Think of it like blinking your eyes. If you blink your eyes real fast, you just let in a little less light. But if you do a very slow blink, imagine how much light actually hits your eyes. Now, this number is shown in a matter of seconds. Most cameras can do a long exposure and have the curtain open for approximately 30 seconds, or you could have a shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second. Now, shutter speed dictates motion. If you have a very fast shutter speed, you could freeze motion. However, if you have a very slow shutter speed, you get what we call motion blur introduced into the image. Now, depending on what you're looking for artistically, both of these things have their very specific use cases. So as you can see with this photo, I'm shooting at a slower shutter speed. My hand is waving and you see all this ghosting and this motion blur in my hand. Now compare that to this photo, which I'm supposed to be waving, but the motion is frozen in place. My hand doesn't look like it's moving at all. Now, once again, it's an artistic choice. Depending on what you're trying to show in your image, you may want to have some form of motion blur. And the way to do that is to use a slower shutter speed. Now, next up is ISO. You can pronounce it ISO or ISO, whatever you want. Now, ISO is a little bit of a tricky thing to understand. ISO controls the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to the light. Whenever I'm doing photography, I focus on the first two legs of the exposure triangle and touch the ISO last. Because although ISO increases the brightness of your image, if you turn it up too much, the image can get a little grainy or what we call noisy. And you see that with little dots in the fuzz in the image. It could be very, very, very distracting. The ISO scale is typically measured in numbers like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and so on and so forth. Each step up doubles the sensitivity to light. So ISO of 200 is twice as sensitive as ISO 100. ISO 400 is 4 times as sensitive as ISO 100. The doubling is called a stop of light. It works pretty much the same way as doubling or halving your shutter speed or aperture values. Now, what are the benefits of shooting with a higher ISO? It allows you to shoot in darker environments without a tripod or flash. You could use faster shutter speeds, which help freeze motion, and you could use smaller apertures for deeper depths of field in low light. Now, the downsides. The image noise increases as ISO goes up. This appears as grain or color speckles, especially in shadows or flat color areas. Your dynamic range is also reduced, meaning less ability to recover highlights or shadows in editing. And your color accuracy can be affected at higher ISOs. So just be very careful jacking this number up. But the cool thing is that modern digital sensors, especially full frame and newer mirrorless cameras, handle higher ISOs much better than older or smaller sensors. These improvements include better noise reduction algorithms or just higher native ISO ranges. Once again, ISO does not work in isolation. It works along with the shutter speed and the aperture. And if you lower your ISO, you'll need more light, either by a slower shutter or a wider aperture. If you raise the ISO, you can shoot faster or use a smaller aperture, but with the risk of more noise. All right, so let's look at this noisy image. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. This is an image with an ISO of over 100,000. And as you can see, especially in the shadows, there's way too much noise. I mean, this image is practically unusable. I don't know in what setting you would ever have to crank up the ISO this high, but this is a clear demonstration of a whole lot of noise throughout the entire photo when you crank up the ISO. Now, this is a clean image with an ISO of 100, and the difference pretty much speaks for itself. So let's do a quick recap on how a camera actually works. Light goes in through the lens. The aperture controls how much light actually reaches the sensor. The shutter controls how long that light hits the sensor. And the ISO controls the sensitivity of the sensor to light. The sensor then captures the image and the camera saves the photo. Got it? Okay, now that we can control how bright the photo is via the exposure triangle, let's make sure what we want to see is actually sharp and clear, and that's where focus comes in. Focus is when the subject of the photo is sharp, whereas the background may be blurry or out of focus. Have you ever taken a photo and the picture looked all blurry? Well, that's focus. You want to make sure that the thing you care about most in the photo, the most interesting thing in the photo, is the part that's nice and sharp. Now, we largely control that with making sure your camera's focus points remain on the particular subject. Now, remember what I said about focal planes when discussing apertures. Wide apertures, a smaller f-stop like f1.8, create a shallow depth of field, as previously mentioned. However, only a thin slice of that focal plane is sharp. Everything in front or behind that slice is out of focus, meaning it's completely blurry. Now, this is great for portraits if you want a blurry background. Think of it like focusing on one page of a book at a time, and everything is out of focus. However, I also want you to remember that the focal plane is always going to be parallel to the lens. meaning if you have a subject that's a little off kilter, like in this image, you're going to get an image where a portion of their face is in focus and a portion of their face is out of focus because they're out of that focal plane. Now, narrow apertures, think of a big f-stop like f11, create a deep depth of field. Think of a thicker slice of the photo that's in focus. More of the scene from front to back is sharp. Now, this is great for landscapes where you want everything in focus. However, when you're doing headshots, I tend to go with a aperture like f8, f11. And this is to make sure that every detail of their face is completely in focus. Also, in wedding photography, with large groups of people, I'm shooting at f8 and above, so that way everybody from front to back is in focus. And now you got the final piece of the puzzle when taking a photo, and that's composition. Composition is how things are arranged in your photo. Composition helps you spread things out so everything looks appealing to the viewer. Now, I'm not going to go through all the compositional techniques because that would take a ridiculously long amount of time. However, composition is incredibly important. If you simply want to take better photos and elevate your image, focus on composition after you have the lighting down. And a popular compositional method is to focus on the rule of thirds. Put your subject off to the side where the grids meet, and boom, you're already following the rule of thirds. And I want you to remember, there is no right composition. There is only intentional composition. The goal is to make your choices on purpose, not by accident. At its core, composition is visual design. It turns snapshots into compelling photographs. Composition is so important because a technically perfect photo, sharp focus, good exposure and all that, can still feel flat or forgettable if the composition is weak. Once again, strong composition directs your attention to your subject. It creates a visual balance and flow. It adds mood, motion, or tension and communicates a message or narrative to your viewer. Then you might ask yourself, how can you practice compositional techniques? Well, number one, you could study great photos and paintings. You could always ask yourself, why does this feel balanced? Number two, during a photo shoot, you might just limit yourself to one compositional technique per shoot. 3, you shoot a single subject 10 different ways, looking at perspective, framing, color, etc. And number 4, you review your own photos and crop differently to test new arrangements. Composition is what separates a technically good photo from an emotionally effective one. It's not about memorizing rules, it's about understanding how people see and using that knowledge to make intentional, expressive images. Now that you have the basics of photography down, that's just simply the foundation for every single great photo. The best part of all this is that you could practice today. Go grab your phone, go grab your camera, and just experiment. That is the number one thing that you could do to get better than most people. Experiment as much as possible. Find your own passion and get your own style and technique, and I promise you that your photos will be elevated to the next level. And if you made it this far in the video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more upcoming content. And if you have any tips to help others on their photography journey, comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, treat yourself with love and respect. And until next time, peace.